Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in this fine world. You're listening to the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and with me in just a couple minutes is a gentleman named Paul Rush. And Paul is the founder of a company called Substantial, which is a digital design agency based in Seattle, Washington. And so if you're already asking yourself, why is he having Paul Rush on the show? Well, let me tell you why. So Paul was introduced to me by a mutual friend of ours, which I mentioned in our conversation coming up in just a couple minutes. And Paul started Substantial 12 years ago. And before that, he started two other companies. So he's been doing this entrepreneur thing for just a couple of decades. And specifically with Substantial, he has sold projects and has worked and partnered with some of the biggest companies in the world, including Amazon, Google, Mercedes-Benz, T-Mobile, Genentech, IDEO, Citibank, and we mentioned some of these in our conversation. And the main topic that we started with, and the reason I wanted to have Paul on the program, is because of his mindset around selling. Because I think a lot of us as founders, as CEOs, as principals at our startup organizations, we have to wear lots and lots of hats. And one of those hats is the sales hat. And what I found, and this is also something I mentioned in the conversation, there's kind of three buckets of founders out there that I found when it comes to selling. So there's the founders who just know they have to sell and they go out and do it, whether they're good at it or not. They're just out there pounding the pavement and they go and do the selling. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are founders that when I talk with them, their question to me is like, well, how do I find somebody to build my sales process? How do I find somebody to sell my stuff? How do I find somebody to help me figure out how to sell? And they don't want to do the selling. And then there are the people in the middle. They're the people that know they need to do the selling and they just don't know what to do or how to go about doing it. And as our conversation unfolded with Paul, we really dove into some specific selling mindsets and in fact leveraged his design thinking mindset and how he applies that to sales. So specifically, some of the topics that we talked about that you should listen for is thinking about sales as being the number one priority for a company. So as he described it, getting a customer is the most important outcome of any business. And so to do that, you need to go out and leave your house. Specifically, then we dove into some of the systems and some of the frameworks that he uses and some of the things that he does every day to make sure that sales is, in fact, the priority, that it makes it easy for him to go out and do the selling, makes it easy for him to go out and build the relationships that he needs to build with some of these biggest companies in the world in order to bring the bacon home into Substantial and get those deals developed and eventually converted into paying customers. We talked about a couple of other things to listen to. We talked about what he called the Goldilocks rule, which is challenging yourself at just the right level. And to make sure that things aren't too easy and that things aren't too hard. And we talked quite a bit about how we can create this Goldilocks rule and apply this Goldilocks rule to selling as a startup. We also talked about the importance of curiosity in the sales process and how curiosity can lead to much deeper and more robust relationships. And that's frankly what you're really going to need, especially if you're selling large enterprise deals, anything that's over 50K, and especially if you're going into the 6 and 7 digits. The relationships and the trust are ultimately what's going to help you move those deals forward well beyond any single product feature or functionality. So we dove really, really deep into some of these perspectives, and I think you're really going to learn a lot, and it's going to be a very thought-provoking podcast interview for you to listen to. So that's the backdrop of the episode. So before we head over to the conversation with Paul, a couple asks of you, if you would. If you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you've heard me make these asks. And so if you would, two things. One, please tell a friend or 10 about the podcast. More and more downloads. We're seeing more and more downloads every episode. We're seeing more and more subscriptions coming through every single month. Like, I'll be honest, I do check those things. Maybe it's a vanity metric. Maybe it's just a little bit of my own ego because I want to know that what we're doing is good. But frankly, like, nothing jazzes us more. Nothing gets me more excited to bring more guests on, to dedicate all of the time and effort and production to doing these podcasts than seeing more people listening to these episodes. It's just the way the world works and just the way that I work. And so, yeah, I do it because I enjoy it and I love it. I also do get motivated when I see the clicks go up and I see the subscriptions go up and I see the downloads go up. So please do tell a friend or 10. And the second thing that I would love for you to do is leave a review for or of the podcast, whether you're listening on iTunes or Stitcher or SoundCloud or Spotify or wherever you're listening to this podcast. Leave a review. Tell us how we're doing. Tell us how we can make things even better, and tell the world that you've been listening to this podcast and how great it is, because the more reviews you get, the easier it is for other people to find this podcast on those different platforms that I just mentioned. Okay. So that's it for now. Let's head over to my conversation with Paul Rush. Hey, Paul, welcome to the Startup Selling Show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, no, it's really good to have you. I'm glad that Jonathan, our mutual friend, put us in touch. One of the things that I always like to do whenever we're kind of kicking off the conversation is just hear straight from you. You know, your name obviously is Paul Rush, and you're the founder at Substantial, which is a digital agency based in Seattle. And I kind of previewed the listeners a little bit about what you do, but I always love to hear straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Like when people ask you, like, hey, what do you do and what does Substantial do? How do you describe that to people?
Yeah, so covering what Substantial does. Substantial is a company I started about 12 years ago. It's a software product development company. So we help our clients bring new software products into market. And what a software product is for us is anything that has a user interface that people use on a regular basis or an ongoing basis. They have a relationship with. Behind the hood or under the hood, that is basically software development and design services. And we integrate those two very tightly because we feel the best products in the world have a great dialogue between design and technology. And that's what you'll notice, I think when you see really successful technology products like, a lot of Apple products and things like Airbnb and Nest, the technology and the design both get out of the way to help serve the real purpose and serve the users. And that's our philosophy for bringing new products to market, is that we want design and technology to work together seamlessly. And we work for a really wide variety of companies, everything from large Fortune 500 companies like Citibank and Mercedes to lots of funded startups and startups that have done quite well, lots of Silicon Valley, LA, Seattle, New York companies. And it's a lot of fun. We get the sort of pleasure of being able to go from nothing to something launched and people using it on a regular basis. We've launched lots and lots of products on lots of formats, mobile, web, and Internet of Things devices. So it's great company.
That's great. And there's lots I want to dig into, especially because one of the things you mentioned is that you started the company 12 years ago. And the topic that you and I were talking quite a bit about in terms of prep here was, how as a founder of a company, you really are always a salesperson. And I want to dig into that a bit more in just a couple of minutes. Before we do that, though, there's two questions I wanted to ask you, maybe a little bit off to the side. You just mentioned in terms of this idea of dialogue between design and technology. And to me, it was a word that really piqued my interest, this idea of dialogue. And I'm wondering if you chose that word on purpose. Like, is that the way you think about it? Like, how do you, when you use that term dialogue, why exactly that choice of?
I don't know if I chose it on purpose, but it definitely is something that I say a lot. I think when people think about design and technology, they think about two separate disciplines. And that's the way that companies used to be structured. Product teams used to be structured with this sort of like wall where design would create a spec or some kind of template for, development or some other engineering party to go build to the spec. And the modern thinking has progressed to the point where it's really a conversation as peers working towards solving problems that users are facing, as opposed to one group talking to another group through some mediated interface, some software project management tool or something like that. It's really, the best stuff comes from having a great interaction or dialogue, as I put earlier, between these two parties. And I think that actually works pretty well in companies in general. If you're thinking about marketing and sales, the best companies, I think, have a great dialogue between those two groups as well, where they're really helping each other perform well because they realize they're part of the same team, which is serving a bigger goal. But for us being product creators, that's the thing we think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it assumes that there's conversation, right? It's interactive. There is interaction. It's not thrown over the wall. And I think the point of, I just think about like the way that software looks now over the last, say, 5 years versus the way software used to look. If you
Right.
look at an old, sort of Windows machine from, the 90s, you're like, wow, like I can't believe we actually used to find that stuff to be modern. And now you look at how intuitive many software products are, and obviously most being web-based and even mobile-based, that, only comes through this constant iteration and evolution that comes through dialogue and through conversation. So I just really like that word. I might steal it when I'm talking.
Yeah, please.
The other question I wanted to quickly ask is, you're based in Seattle, and I know you've worked with companies all over the country, all over the world. You mentioned LA and Silicon Valley. How do you describe the vibe of the sort of tech scene in Seattle as you compare it to Silicon Valley or Austin or LA or Portland or some of these other areas? Do you feel like there's a distinct feel to the Seattle vibe as compared to the others?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a topic that I could talk about for a long time because I think about these things a lot. And it's very interesting for us, when you're hiring people, like what kind of culture are you hiring from? And as you think about international, that's also super interesting. But, I've had the sort of pleasure of living in multiple of these cities at different times and overlapping. So I've been in San Francisco and Seattle basically for the last 15 years, and I've also lived in New York. So you get to see the difference in the culture in these places, and there are large differences. Seattle is, this interesting ecosystem of technology companies that has a really unusual characteristic because we're one of the only places that has companies the same size as Silicon Valley on the top end. So, Amazon and Microsoft are these two juggernaut companies, super influential in the space. And there's other big companies here as well, Boeing, Starbucks, Costco. And when you think about New York, it's hard to find companies that are technology companies that are the same size. Or Los Angeles, where, the biggest thing you'd have is like Snap, or I'm trying to think of another one, but that's not even close to the size of, what Amazon is and the influence that it has on technology. So that's a positive thing. It draws talent and it's great. But the problem is Silicon Valley has done such a great job of building this ecosystem that has scale at every level. So there's tons of small companies, there's tons of small, mid-sized companies, tons of mid companies, mid-large, and then very large. And Seattle has this dominant culture of, at first it was just Microsoft, that I think sucked all the talent into it. And so you don't have as much in between. And that makes it, I think, a little harder for people to feel supported by the ecosystem as they're going through getting funding and growing their businesses. It really changes the company, the sort of corporate culture to feel like a bigger company town. And the people you're hiring often are people with big company experience, which can be difficult if you're building a small startup, to have people know how to just hit the ground running, not need a lot of resources or infrastructure for support. So it is very interesting to think of how different. You'd think that if you go to New York or London, because they're so big and they have so many resources available to people, that they'd have the same feel as Silicon Valley for starting companies, but they absolutely don't. It's just a totally different thing. Silicon Valley dominates the landscape for that sort of support at every size and talent that is wanting every size of company in its growth path.
Yeah, no, thanks for that insight. I'm always curious to hear people's perspective, and it's clear to me that you have spent a lot of time thinking about it.
Yeah,
I hadn't thought about it in that way, in terms of the behemoths that are there and how it is.
It's a great city.
Different than,
it's a great city, and a lot of people are leaving. Yeah, a lot of people are leaving Silicon Valley areas for places that are, outside. You get more access to nature. It's more of a chill environment, different perspectives, and Seattle certainly is a really wonderful place.
Cool. Let's dive in a little bit to, or maybe a lot bit into kind of the core topic we want to talk about, which is, as a founder, as an entrepreneur, you always are a salesperson. And the way I think I wanted to maybe kick off this part of the conversation, Paul, is, you started this company 12 years ago as the founder. Was there a moment where a light bulb went off for you, where you said, you may have said, like, I want to do great design, I want to build great products, but was there a kind of a seminal moment or a trigger or a light bulb that goes like, oh, but if I want to do those things, I have to be really good at sales? Or is it something that for you was more innate?
That's an interesting question. I think there have been many light bulb moments over the course of the time that I've been starting businesses. Substantial is the third company that I've started. Let's see if there's a couple that come to mind. I think it's really about, I've always wanted to start businesses, and I think people get lost in lots of details when you're thinking about starting a business that aren't necessarily what business actually is until you're there, until you're sort of forced into thinking about how do I actually make this thing work. I think people fall in love with products.
Like what? Like what are some things that people get lost?
Well, people want to build a product, right? They get really in love with an idea for a product, or they get in love with the idea of like getting together with a group of people and working on something hard together. Some of the may or may not be romantic imagery of people staying up all night working, on something that they're super passionate about is all really great stuff, but it needs to operate on the system that we're in, and the system that we're in requires money to be coming into the business and going out as a necessary piece of it. And really any business breaks down at some point into component pieces that sales drives. So sales is the thing that wraps around everything. And you can't have a business without selling. There's many like famous quotes about this, that, everything starts with a sale. So maybe every young entrepreneur goes through this where they realize, oh my God, we actually have to make money. Otherwise we can't be a business. We're something else. We're like a club or, just an experimental group or whatever. And that's probably great stuff too. But the process of making money is super fascinating, and building a system that's reliable for it is a really cool design problem, and something that I think is noble, because it actually provides some great value for the people in it, and provides the self-sustaining function for building products and making ideas real. So the first time that hit me was in the first company that I set up, and I was wondering kind of why we weren't getting business by just sitting in my house and telling my friends that I was doing this thing. You realize pretty quickly that you actually have to, and this is a sort of metaphor that I use a lot when I'm talking to people, in sales or getting off the ground with entrepreneurship. You actually have to leave your house. You have to get out there and you have to start talking to people. And, I think a lot of what we do, it's very easy, particularly with a lot of the digital technology that we have, like to think that you can just interact with the world through the mediums, but face to face and talking to people and really, proactively getting out there is super, super important. So that might be the first like big light bulb moment, is that leaving your house and talking to people is really important. And I don't know if that sounds too basic, but it's
no, it's I think the suggestion of leave your house, it's akin on the product side, from a lean startup point of view. Steve Blank talks about getting out of the building, right? You can design a product you think looks great until you put it in front of users. You're never going to know. And I think the metaphor holds from a sales process standpoint or from a selling standpoint. People are just not going to come flock to your product. You have to go out there and evangelize. And so I was imagining, as you were saying, you started this company and you're telling your friends about it. I was sort of imagining you sitting at a kitchen table. Was there something that you just like all the bills came due, or you just realized, okay, we've been at this for a couple months and we don't produce any revenue. If I don't produce revenue, I have to go back and get a day job. Was there something there that you're like, okay, today's the day I'm going to get off my ass and leave my house and start talking to people?
Yeah, I always feel like, no, I mean, that's pretty close to it. I always feel like people's first company should be I'm a big fan of bootstrapping for many, many, many reasons. But, starting a company with not much of a runway is a great way to make sure that you actually take action. It's so easy to burn, and you see this so many times, it's so easy to burn capital while you're in the ideation phase and to hang out there for too long and to be kind of scared of launching products, getting things out into the wild, because, then your ego is at risk for hearing that maybe people don't like it or whatever. But that's actually the stuff super important to get at as fast as possible. And so when you start actually seeing your runway disappearing in front of you, you're really motivated to go out and start crossing that big first mental bridge, in entrepreneurship and sales, which is, I really got to close a deal here. I got to prove to myself that this is something that could work. And that makes you do the right things. It's a classic thing in the Valley where companies will raise like $20 million, spend 18 million of it doing something, and then they have $2 million left going, holy crap, we have to actually have a product now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think even if it's not even 20 million, if it's 2 million, I think there's some pretty good angel funding and seed funding out there where we run into teams all the time where, they've got the basis of a team, they've got a decent product, they got some core funding, and there's a sense of like, well, okay, now what? Now what do we do? And so I think from like thinking about founders and selling, just to simplify, I sort of think about them in three categories. So there's the founders that know they have to sell. And even if they don't like it, or even if they're scared of it, they just know they have to go out and do it. So I had that experience when I was at a startup called Blend. CEO is a guy named Nima. I'm sorry, he's still there as the CEO. And he just learned that he had to sell. And so he was technical, but he would get on airplanes and he would go out and talk to people. And it was just like he and I worked as partners, even though it's head of sales. Then you have people on the other end, when you run into some of these folks where it's just like, well, I have this product and I'm looking to hire somebody to do the selling for me. I'm looking for somebody to figure out how to sell my thing. And I feel like there's no about an explanation to those people that are ever going to get them to realize like, no, you have to sell. But then you have the people in the middle, and maybe this is where the best advice is that that we could talk through now, which is like founders that say, okay, I get it. I know I need to sell, but I don't know what to do, or I'm really scared, or I'm really like, I have this fear of rejection, or I'm not quite sure how to even go about it. And so for those people in the middle, like what are a couple of key things that really helped you? If you can think specifically about your own experience that got you from the kitchen table to leave your house, that got you from, okay, I've got this company versus now it's actually a real enterprise.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question. So you're asking like, how do you get yourself to move? How do you get yourself started down the path?
I might know I need to leave the house. I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I know I need to leave the house, but like, where do I go? What do I do? How do I get myself through this? Sometimes it's a fear factor sort of chasm where I just got to get like, was there anything specifically that like any kind of mental calisthenics or any models that you used that helped you get from sitting at the kitchen table to actually leaving the house and talking to people?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing that I've learned that I apply now when I'm thinking about these things is that closing deals is the most important thing for business, period. So everything else that you're doing is less important than that, including building your product. So this is maybe a philosophical thing first, but the way I think about starting some new product or enterprise is that getting a customer is the most important part. And that should be your goal, not building a product, not shipping it or launching it, because many, many, many businesses have been built successfully off of the sell then build model, where you go out and you sell something. Selling can be many things, right? So there's not just, you've closed a contract or gotten a check, but it could also be getting some kind of agreement from a potential customer that they would use that, or some kind of, the verbal yes, the verbal agreement that they're interested. So even those things give you proof that you're working in the right direction and that your pitch is landing. I mean, I work in a world where I'm selling large enterprise deals, so it's a bit of a different world than people selling, a SaaS subscription service for, $10 a month. But even then, there's lots of tools and techniques you could use to set yourself up so that you've got a web page or a landing page where people are, putting in their credit card number for you to launch your service, and then you have a positive that you're actually moving in the right direction. I think selling is that sort of canary in the coal mine. It's the first thing that tells you whether you're onto something or not. And so this isn't really like how to psych yourself up. It's more of how do you set priorities as an organization, that selling is the first thing. It's the enabling thing that everything comes after that. And it's not that product development and all the other operational pieces of business aren't important. They're all vitally important. It's just there's an order of operations, and the sale is the first thing that really kicks business into gear. There's a couple of other thoughts there, but does that resonate with you? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it does. And I'd love to hear more thoughts if you've got them. And then like you're talking about, like everything starts with a sale. I remember that when I'm old enough to have listened to Zig Ziglar audio cassettes. So people that you sounds like maybe you know who Zig Ziglar is. A lot of people nowadays know who he is.
What a name, huh?
And I used to drive around in between. I used to sell college textbooks in the late 90s. It was just CD-ROMs and web companion websites were sort of this new thing. So it was campus to campus, and then driving to campuses, I would have these like literally these cassettes that I'd pop in and listen to Zig Ziglar. And one of his mantras was always, everything starts with a sale. Everything starts with a sale, like, because you can't manufacture the pencil, and the people that manufacture the pencil don't have jobs, and those, like, nothing happens downstream until a sale happens. So when you talked about getting a customer is the most important outcome, or setting sales as a priority, it's really just, I think a lot of it is just mindset and saying like sales is not the afterthought on a Friday afternoon if I get around to it, or when I get around to it. It's like, no, that's the thing that comes first. And then I build product and engineering and hiring and everything else around it. So your first ideas there reminded me of those old Zig Ziglar tapes. So thank you for that. Yeah. It brought me back to, almost 25 years ago. But what are, you said you had maybe some additional thoughts.
Yeah, there's probably two other things.
Really nice.
Sort of philosophical framework that I'm trying to use and I'm writing about right now that I think applies to everything in life, including this. But I think it's super powerful. And it's something that I was aware of before I'd heard this guy speaking about it. But Daniel Kahneman, the famous economist and author, he wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, which is a really interesting and dense book. He has this statement, which other people have said, and it's a kind of a design principle that I really like, which is make it easy to do the right thing. And I think that is so powerful that we should be applying it to everything from government to our personal lives and to everything else, but it certainly applies to sales and business too. So make it easy to do the right thing. The idea behind it is design systems, design your life, design the way you work so that the things that you need to get done are easy to do. So if you live, in a place that's close to a gym and you sign up to that gym as opposed to a gym that takes 30 minutes to get to, your chances of going to the gym are vastly greater. And there's many things like this, that you can sort of set up. But that's like an easy one for a lot of people to understand. Easy. If your gym is downstairs from where you live, it will be easier for you to go. And for, sales, thinking about this, putting sales first thing, I think a lot of entrepreneurs don't want to make the cold call. They don't want to send the email that they need to send or try to get a meeting with people doing whatever kind of outreach they need to do. And we have as I understand it, we have a certain amount of willpower reserve, and that can go down over the course of a day. So there's the principle of, eat the frog, which is do the hardest thing first. If you can set up your life where you get into a habit, which, I think, the right habits can be super powerful, of waking up and before you do anything at work, before probably you even check social media or just browse around Reddit or whatever it is that you do that's not work, it's so easy to do. You just go ahead and do a half hour to an hour of the hardest thing that you need to do that day. The chances of you getting to the hardest thing go up dramatically. And that's a sort of systemic approach to whatever it is that you need to do. And usually those things are, writing some of those carefully worded emails to try to get to a client or picking up the phone or something similar to that. So maybe that's another small thought.
Yeah, I like that for a lot of reasons. Just to unpack it, I'm familiar with Daniel Kahneman's work, both because of the book that you mentioned. I'd studied some of his stuff when I was I have an economics degree, so I'm familiar with it from that standpoint.
Oh, right.
And even further, when I think about even myself, one of the things I like to do is writing. And if I don't start writing first thing in the morning before I open up email and do this other stuff, then the blog posts don't get written. And so that's one way I just keep that stuff off until it's time to do that writing. Now, to further that, what I would say is when you say, look, if I got to do an hour of selling every day, then even further, what I would say is don't wake up and think, okay, now who am I going to call today? Or who am I going to email today? Like you said, make it easy to do the right thing. Hiring something as basic as hiring virtual assistants to do all the research for you, to have that call list so that when you need to do those 10 calls, you just open up the spreadsheet and voila, all the data is there, because the willpower, does go away and the time fritters away, and every minute that you're spending, researching stuff as opposed to making phone calls is an opportunity cost of time. So I think there's the system approach that you're talking about, this designing a system that makes it easy to do these hard things that you need to do. I think a lot of it is just a matter of just getting very deliberate about it.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. It's so easy to sort of let life go and follow where it goes, but you get a lot more power and a lot more momentum if you design how you are going to attack your problems. And obviously you can't think about that forever. You have to actually attack the problem. People get caught up there too, but living, on purpose by design, I think is super powerful. You don't want to just pick a goal and then just do random things to try to get there. It makes sense to be systematic and deliberate. So I thoroughly agree. And there's a lot of ways you can set yourself up for success, which is another thing I'm trying to build into my life now as well. Things I think I did the whole time, but I'm trying to be more deliberate about it, and increasing amount of deliberates, like with all these things. There's the Goldilocks rule, which is basically challenging yourself at the right level, that people perform and are engaged most when you find that, this is like the flow state theory, where if you find things that are at the right level of challenging, if it's too challenging, it's frustrating, you don't make progress, it's hard to see results. If it's too easy, you get bored. So there's that zone of optimal challenge. And I don't know exactly how you'd apply that to sales. Maybe there's interesting ways you can think of, but when you're going out there and you're learning to like play an instrument, you don't want to be starting off with pieces that are impossible, and you don't want to sit there and do scales all day. You want to find things that are at your level. And I think probably things apply the same way to, when you're training for a race or whatever, you can't go too hard too fast. You want to like ratchet up your involvement. And these systems, I think there's game design that people are thinking about along these lines, to how to maximally engage people and keep them at the right level. But you can set that up for yourself too, to make sure that you're not staying in a comfort zone, and make sure that you're not, trying things too hard. So, if you're writing a piece and you want to publish a piece, try writing short pieces at first if you're not used to writing, because that's easier to finish and feel accomplished, as opposed to thinking I'm going to write, War and Peace tomorrow. That is a pretty good idea, or a good way to make yourself feel pretty miserable really fast and be very discouraged.
Yeah, like I'm going to sit down and write the great American novel. I've always wanted to write a novel, but if you've never even sat down and done like a 1,000-word blog post, then maybe you should just like sit down and just get a regular writing schedule and write 500 words a day, even if it's stuff you never publish, just to get into that habit, so that eventually when you do need to write a 50,000 word novel, it's not as difficult. But totally. I think from yeah.
No, it's just amazing how many people do that, right? And as like when we're younger, we get so enamored with this idea of I'm going to write the great American novel, or the great whatever country you're in novel. That's a great aspiration, but that's not a great way to approach accomplishing a goal, because you're going after, you're eating the whole pizza at once, as opposed to having a slice of it. There's a lot you can do to build your way up to that. Just agreeing with you.
Yeah. Well, I think from a selling standpoint, just some thoughts that come to mind for me, Paul, is this idea of the right level. So like we see this with startups, like you mentioned with your companies, you've sold to Mercedes and Google and some of the largest companies in the world, but that wasn't your first customer. You didn't start off by saying like, oh, we're going to sell to Citibank today, and that's going to be customer number one. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to temper some of the vision that you've got for where the company can go with where it is right now. And so, starting off with, if there's in my world, I spent a lot of time selling to banks and lenders. And so in the early days, we'd start selling to smaller, at least having conversations with smaller banks where the risk was lower. And we can use that as a learning opportunity, so that, when we did get in front of Chase down the road, it wasn't the first time we uttered the words around the pitch or uttered the words around the product demo.
Yeah.
And additionally, so that's just thinking from a customer standpoint, but then also thinking about like, who are you reaching? So if you're sitting there on day one as a founder and you're saying like, man, I hate to do cold calling. It's really hard to do cold calling. I've never done it before. Well, maybe before you start cold calling, why don't you just sit down and make a list of people from LinkedIn that and start talking to them about your product, and then expand, and then get a referral or an intro to somebody else. Kind of start with that kernel where you're really comfortable. It's still challenging because you have to talk about your product and try to sell it. And maybe the sale in that case is just getting an intro to somebody else versus, trying to sell to Citibank out of the gate. So I think this idea of zones, I can almost imagine like somebody drawing concentric circles on a piece of paper and saying, okay, like my most comfortable zone is in the middle. What's the next zone out from there, to the point where maybe 5 or 6 zones later, you get to the pure cold call, so that you're building up that muscle and getting comfortable enough in that next zone. And then as soon as you get comfortable, it's time to take the lead to the next zone.
Oh, that's great. No, that's totally great. I think it's like reducing the number of variables in the equation that you're dealing with. Like you've got the degree of how much you know a person is one of those. And then another one is how confident are you selling a product that you're very early with. And so if you just are working with people that you know well, that makes it way, way easier to call them up. I mean, these are people who are happy to take your call as opposed to people who are super skeptical about why you're calling them. And thinking about that is how to reduce the number of variables you're working on at the same time so that you can practice one at a time, I think is super, super effective for getting these things off the ground.
Yeah. And I also, and love to hear more about your experience as you were ramping up sales in any of your companies. I think a lot of times there's this preconceived notion like, okay, what is selling? Well, selling is sending cold email blasts out to 1,000-person list that I scraped, or selling is cold calling, or selling is setting up a booth and beating badges. And then we'll just sort of like hope that one of those people come through. Well, all of those may be environments that are uncomfortable to somebody who's never sold before. And so if you peel back and start with a list of people you already know, or people that you're connected to from business school or whatever that is, you might actually find out you don't even need to do those other things, because at the earliest stages, like you only need to get 10 customers, or you only need to get to $1 million in revenue at the earliest stages. So maybe you just find that those customers and that revenue just from the inner circles versus having to go too far out from that sort of core zone. So it might actually be a side benefit that you're actually setting the game up for yourself to be too difficult if you dive into those outer zones versus starting with the inner zones where you're most comfortable.
Yeah, and I'm sure that everybody, maybe here knows that the term friendly and warm introductions as opposed to cold introductions, but there's lots of ways you can get people who, the trust transfers through the person you're getting the introduction from. And so if it's someone that you know well, you can start with your inner circle or people you know well, and then try to get those people to introduce you to people who are people that they know, and they're much more likely to be open and receptive to talking to you, when you're coming from someone that they know. Another great thing that I think about a lot, and I try to teach people in and around selling, and we should come back to this topic of what is selling, because that's a super fascinating topic too. But when you're thinking about approaching people, I think curiosity is like probably one of the best approaches you can take, and just being really curious to hear what people have to say and not making it about what you're selling, but giving them a prompt to talk about what they need in relation to what you're selling. And being deeply curious and fascinated about their problem set, remembering that it's about them. And one approach I use a lot is that I actually tell people I'm not selling at all. I'm just actually looking for feedback. And when you ask people for help, which basically is what feedback is, or any kind of help, you're engaging this sort of reciprocity thing where you're putting them on the position of sort of power and value, and saying, I can really benefit from your help, and that makes them feel important and good. And people want to feel important and good. So it's easy to be able to get on the phone and say, hey, you've got a great perspective about this. I'm looking to start a product in this space or whatever. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about it. And that winds up, often being very valuable for the feedback, and sets the stage for selling in a way that is much more about the person moving towards you as about you pulling the person to you, if that makes sense.
I think it makes a lot of sense, because it also, in a lot of ways, it disarms the person you're speaking with a little bit, in that, if you approach them as a salesperson and say, hey, I've got this product and do you want to learn more about it? Then they immediately put up the armor.
Yep.
And say, okay, well, now, okay, I might be willing to have a conversation with you. I may not be. If I am, I'm still going to do it with a certain amount of guard. I'm not going to reveal for you what my real problem is, because I don't trust you, or I'm afraid that you're going to try to pitch me. And so this idea of curiosity, it reminds me, just yesterday, I was on a coaching call with a client who's setting up a booth at a conference, and he is a founder. He can't make it, and he does most of the selling himself. So his two co-founders are going, and they're even farther removed from doing the selling every day. And so we're just trying to come up with some strategies of how to engage people in the booth. And because it's like, okay, I'm at a trade show and here's the product, do you want to see it? And it turns out that the problem they solve is about testing arsenic in water supply. And even further, it turns out there are kind of two basic tests that need to happen. But it turns out most people don't do the second test, even though they know they should, or they just simply don't know that they should. And so if you test for one way but not the other, you're actually going to get an incomplete test. It's just the core of it. So I said, well, that's actually the question you should ask people when they come in the booth. Like, hey, I was curious to know, when you're testing for arsenic, do you use both of these tests or just one? It's not a sales question. It's assessing their knowledge. It's assessing whether or not they have this problem, because their products test for the second thing that most people don't know about, or they don't do it because it's really hard, or they don't know how. And so just simply asking that question from a curiosity standpoint, it's an innocuous question. It's more of an intellectual question that gets people talking about what their process is with testing arsenic in the water supply, which can then eventually obviously lead to uncovering a problem that you can solve with the product. But it's all based on curiosity, not, hey, are you testing for arsenic, or do you want to see how we test for arsenic in your water? And I think the more that you can develop these types of questions around your sales process, whether you're a salesperson or a founder, I think it just disarms people, and it also just creates a whole different level of conversation that you would versus what you normally get if it's a sales.
Totally. If you approach things as a salesperson, you are setting up roles where you have a salesperson and a customer, and then people play out those roles the way that they think those roles exist in the world, right? You're sort of setting yourself up, and that would happen in anything in the world. If you're a person at a restaurant ordering, food, then you've got a server and a customer relationship. But if you approach it as literally you're embodying, or I guess maybe figuratively embodying the role of is it literal or figurative if it's a conceptual thing? I don't know which one it is. I guess you're embodying the role of a curious observer or a researcher or a friend or whatever else, and that's the frame of mind you're in. Then that traditional role relationship doesn't get triggered, and you don't wind up in the pitfalls of like, this person's trying to sell me something. It's more like, hey, we're having a conversation about this thing, and I'm curious, and I want your help, and just so you should know this regardless of whatever you're doing. Here's some interesting information, whatever.
Yeah, I mentioned the textbook selling I used to do, and one of the things they taught us when I was at Prentice Hall was to simply ask people, how do they teach the course, and what's the most difficult topic that they tend to cover in that course. So if you're teaching economics or sociology or accounting, there's usually a couple of chapters or a couple of topics that are just really tough for students to get. And so by asking that question, then if it's cost accounting, they might come up with, okay, well, usually right around mid-semester when we cover such and such topic, it gets really hard for students. They kind of track it until then, and then they get a bunch of students that fall off the cliff and they fail the midterm. Like, okay, cool. Well, do you mind if we just take a look at how our book covers that particular topic? And then you just reach down off the shelf, you pull off the copy that you sent to them, and you just open the book to that chapter. And the real trick here is when you're in a professor's office, there's the desk, and they're on one side and you're on the other. And the trick here is to pull the book off the shelf, put it in front of them, remain standing, and walk to their side of the desk. So you're standing side by side and looking at the book together. So it just immediately creates a psychological partnership. I'm on that side of the table with you, investigating this problem, as opposed to trying to pitch you on why you should use our cost accounting book.
Yeah, that's such real stuff. I mean, if you can embody a framework of being on the same team with the people that you're with, what does that really mean? If you were really on their team, if you worked at their company, if you were working with them on their problems, like, you'd be considering what the biggest problems are, where your risks are, what you're scared about, and you'd actually be addressing those things. So I think it's like that stuff winds up being super, super powerful for sure.
Can you think of, based on some of the companies that you sold to, we talked about some of the largest companies in the world that you partnered with. Can you think of a specific situation where it was just really clear that you were able to position yourself as that partner even before they signed the contract? I mean, you're sitting there, I'm sure, in a lot of cases when you're doing software development and design, there's months that go into speccing out a project and putting together a proposal even before that contract is signed. So maybe if you could think of an example, I think it would be really useful as an illustration of some of the folks that are listening.
So the thing about where I am right now is that my world is really about developing relationships at the early stage and then bringing them into my sales team to sell. So I haven't actually been in the closing part of the sales process for years. There are stories actually at the beginning.
That part of it. Well, yeah, that like what you're doing right now would be, I think, even more valuable, because you've got to get that counterpart to trust you enough to engage in a conversation, to engage with you and get them to share their problems so that they feel comfortable enough being handed over to a sales team.
Yeah. And trust is another interesting thing to talk about in terms of what how do you build trust? That's another whole area. Okay, what question are we talking about? Like building early stage trust, or how do we?
Yeah, like because if I'm a founder of a company, whether it's design like you do, or software, or manufacturing, it doesn't really matter. If I'm out there and I'm the best salesperson, kind of building off our previous part of our conversation, I know I need to go out there. I know I need to sell. The selling shouldn't feel like selling. The selling should feel like a curious or intellectual conversation. And so if I can get myself in that position, what are some of the things that you tend to do that you find works really well to get that trust starting to build, to get to the point where the selling doesn't feel like selling, so that I'm still in this comfort zone using this Goldilocks rule? Is there any kind of frameworks that you use, or anything that you do when you're talking to Genentech or T-Mobile or any of the other companies you've worked with?
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of establishing rapport works on a lot of levels that goes pretty deep. See if it's that, or thinking about trust in a broader sense. Okay, so one thing I'll say is that imagine, if you're thinking about what selling is, making your pitch and closing a deal is probably what people think of when they think of selling. And to me, that would be like looking at the tip of the iceberg without considering the rest of everything else that's underneath it and how much bigger that is. Because it's it gets into like an art of war kind of scenario, which is, if you're thinking about that in that metaphorical context, you want to set your battles up for success before you've even fought them. So by the time you're making your pitch, you have as much behind you, the winds are in your favor as the pitch is happening. And all of that was done way ahead of time. So if you're in a world, I think the best way to become a great salesperson, depends on what kind of person you are. There are people who I think are salespeople who are very good at just going after the abstract goal. I'm not one of those. I really need to be engaged in the landscape of what I'm selling or involved in. Number one, I would say, are you in that mode? Because if you are really interested in the product, service, or thing that you're selling, you're going to be able to do all of that early groundwork a lot more naturally. If you care about it, if you're really interested in it, it's very easy to then go out and start meeting people who are in that world, just to get to know the space and to be able to build those relationships. So getting in front of people without the context of selling at all, and even thinking about selling because you're just curious and you really like this industry or the space, is the beginning of forming real trust. And that's where you actually just make friends with people in your industry. A lot of people in sales think of selling as prospects, and I'm going to sell the prospects, but can you actually establish some kind of friendship with your potential customers first? Because everything from there just flows so much easier. That's the iceberg under the water. If you can be liked and trusted by the people that you're selling to, that's great. And you can't always be in that situation. So there's degrees to which you can do that, but I think you can also condense that entire process to a short amount of time, where when you're first getting to know a person that you think might be interested, you think about it as developing a long-term relationship. You think about it as developing a basis for trust as quickly as possible. And then you can break down what trust means for you. In a lot of cases, that's, being able to speak in an intelligent way about their world, not your world, but their world. Being able to get back to them very quickly and be responsible with your activities in the sort of early dealings. And there was a third one I was thinking of. Can let those two sit for now. I'll probably think about it in a second. But anyway, I just think about this. How do you rapidly build trust before you even pitch someone, as being probably the biggest factor that would give you a chance of success. And by actually understanding and knowing what their problems are. It's so easy to get on the phone and try to sell your product, but it's actually more fun to get on the phone and try to understand where a person's at. You should want to walk away sometimes as a salesperson because your product doesn't fit what they need. I don't know if that's answering the question, but there's a lot there about building trust that I feel like gets to how you make a sale happen before you've even pitched.
Well, I think it speaks a lot to there's a mechanical side of the sale that becomes very, very easy now, right? With marketing automation software or email automations or, this sort of spray and pray where you can just set up a 5-step email sequence that goes out in over 10 days and you're, sort of batch and blast and you're like, okay, I'm doing the selling. It's very mechanical and it feels like selling. And what you're saying is it's like the polar opposite of that, which is getting to understand, empathizing with the market, understanding the problem, learning about where people are coming from, establishing the relationships. Because while that takes more time and it's more difficult to do, you think about the cost benefit of that versus sending out 1,000 batch and blasts every day for 100 days, you're probably going to get much better customers and relationships and a much higher win rate down the road. And so if you're an early stage company, you don't have to get to $10 million in revenue next month. Usually it's just we need to get the next customer. We need to go from 5K MRR to 10K MRR. And the ones after that from 10 to 15 and from 15 to 20. So that at the end of the year, we've gotten to $500,000 run rate. So is there anything if you think about your calendar, where you're spending your time, if you go back the last 60 days or look ahead to the next 2 months, is there anything specific that you do? Are you sitting down and picking up the phone? Are you going to LinkedIn? Are you getting introductions? Are you going to conferences? How do you create these relationships and friendships that enable you to get into a sales conversation down the road? What's the Paul Rush playbook for this?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out how much of all the things to talk about and which things to talk about. I'll say this. Well, okay, so there's a couple of things to say. One is that I don't know if what I'm saying really works for a certain stripe of companies, because my business sells sort of larger contracts to a very small group of individuals. And if you think about the sales process and how that applies, there's these bands of price points that affect the emotional factors for selling. And if you're selling something that's, 50 cents, that's a very different emotional choice than if you're selling something that's $500,000. And so companies at different bands have to think very differently about how they're selling. If you're at enterprise sales, which I would probably say starts at 50 to 75K, somewhere around there, maybe, you're selling to a small audience of decision makers who are making decisions for lots of reasons that are potentially very big for them. Deals with their promotions, their jobs, where they're going, what's happening in their world. And so that's one kind of sale. If you're selling a SaaS product that's $20 a month, that gets to a more discretionary, and I think you get to things like brand affinity and maybe some more practical things of how well you're demonstrating the product value up front. So they're very different things to be thinking about. So in my world,
let's take the enterprise sale, because there's lots of folks that we work with in our coaching program and people that I interact with every day that are selling 50, 100. Talked to a guy yesterday, he sold a $350,000 deal, and he's a startup. It's customer number 12. So
that's great.
I think there are folks that are in this same kind of world that you're in, even though you're selling design services. It's still a $200K contract, right? So that's what I'm curious about your Paul Rush playbook for building relationships.
In that world, I think it's really important and useful to really be fascinated by people. Either you could say that you love human beings, or you're really fascinated by them. Both pretty much work, because you're going to be spending time with people to develop relationships. There's a lot to say about relationship development, but the sort of playbook that I use is to spend as much time with people that I feel like are in my buyer categories or related categories as possible. And I have lots of ways that I do that. The first thing to do, which I think people skip over and has been really value unlocking for us when we do this, is to figure out who your buyers are. A lot of people skip this and just try to go for what they see, but it allows you to focus and find the right people. Often there's a bunch of people call them buying personas. I think there's probably different ways to describe this, but often you'd have a handful of them. And I think the typical advice is that you don't want to have more than 3, maybe 4 at the most. You probably would know better, Scott, than I do. But identifying those so that you can narrow down who you want to spend your time with, and then finding ways to spend time with them. And that could probably vary from industry to industry. What I do is I just take people out for dinner constantly. I think about, I'm actually thinking about launching a couple different kinds of conference series. And I'm doing this because I actually really want to do conferences, and I really like hanging out with the better people in my industry. A lot of those people have become some of my best friends, and it's a positive benefit that it winds up yielding work from time to time. But that's not the intent of it. The intent is actually because I want to develop these relationships. So I just spend as much time as I can handle, being out with people in groups and one-on-one to develop relationships and make it really about the sort of the value I can provide by giving these people an opportunity to meet each other. So I do dinners all the time, and I've done several weekend retreats with people, and all of these are great ways to jumpstart the process. But it has to come from somewhere that's genuine. You can't have it be about your work. It has to be about something else. So that's the sort of like edge areas. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense, because I think that's where, like, the way I've described it to like a lot of founders that come to me and they're asking for help, and I look at their sales process, we just kind of unpack it, and they're like, okay, here's our sales funnel, and here's our tech stack, and these are the emails we're sending, and this is our demo rate and our conversion rates and all that stuff. And what they forget is that as a founder of a company, you started your company because you saw a problem in the marketplace that nobody else was solving, or they weren't solving it the right way. And so you have this idea and you're like, I'm going to change this. I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to make an impact in my business. And so in a lot of ways, you are setting yourself up as the leader of a new crusade. And your job is to almost like rally the market and rally the people, in this case, the buyer personas that you most want to affect, and get them to understand, like to get them to talk to each other, get them to communicate, get them to talk about the problem. And then the sale, like you said, that's where you build the trust. That's where you build the relationship. And then the sale is easy down the road. And the mechanical part of the sale, where I'm just like, click send, click send, click send, demo, that's easy to do, but it's not effective. What you're describing is actually kind of hard, because it requires you to go out and create events, or it requires you to go out and create community. The long-term benefit, though, is really popular and really huge. I mean, that's why you see user conferences are like, I went to one from a company called Outreach back in March of this year. It's about 1,000 people there. They were just like fanatical about like sales development, because that's what this company solves. And they created that community around it. And you see it with Dreamforce, Gainsight, customer success platform,
totally.
has their stuff. And you can pair that all the way down. Like you mentioned dinners and small events. There's a book called Mastermind Dinners by a guy named Jason Gaynard, Jayson Gaynard. And he basically built his entire company and built his whole business around doing exactly what you just described, which is getting together groups of 4 or 6 like-minded people and organizing that, getting together, talking about stuff. And the relationship that he built has allowed him to really launch his entire, it's not even just a company, it's like a whole movement of idea exchange. And it all comes from the fact that he spent time and effort focusing on relationships versus just like batch and blast.
Yeah, and I'm going to check that book out, because I think there's a lot of overlap there, and I hadn't heard of it with what I'm thinking about. But I really think that, authenticity can't be emphasized enough in these things. Whatever you do to try to spend time with people, it has to be authentic for a couple reasons. One is you're not going to want to do it if it's not something that you're really interested in the long term, and that actually is huge. And 2, people will see it. They'll know that you're doing something that you think is really valuable. I'm actually thinking about my next business being around bringing people together in the real world. I think there's an interesting moment for relationships and relationship development in the world, where all the technology that we've built, in social media and sort of internet, are these mediums that actually don't give us what we really need as human beings, sort of evolutionary biological creatures, that we need to be face to face with people. We need to be seeing their facial reaction to what we're saying, to be able to really feel like we can connect with them. And all of this sort of, the Facebook and Instagram movements are pulling us away from that. It's a feeling of being connected without actually being connected to people. And that's why I think you're seeing a rise in attendance in conferences, why lots of businesses are doing them, but also people are doing them for fun, why things like Coachella and Burning Man and, private member houses and, phenomena, even attendance, I think, to parks is going up, which is interesting. People want to do things in real life. And I think that's going to be a continual growing need. And so I'm right there. I feel that. I want that. Bringing people together for dinner is something that I want to do, because I think it's something that it's beautiful and very powerful for people connecting, and people enjoy it and they get to meet each other, but it's something that I care about. So if you're going to do something similar, make sure it's something that you care about. Find something that you care about that helps you build the relationships that you need for your business. This happens to be what I like. But for, anybody who's listening, they may find something else that is deeply connected to who they are. Yeah. I don't know. That authenticity is something that I feel like you see sales in movies and it feels so, I don't know, smarmy, disconnected, salesy, that's the reason why that word has a negative connotation. But the reality is when you're doing something from your heart, you're lining up sort of powerful momentum to make things happen. So I always look for that. I always look for that in people that I'm hiring and people that, I want to spend time with, is how authentic are they being? And it's okay if you don't know right away what it is that's your thing, but try things, find something that feels right for you and something that you can invest in.
Just leave the house.
Yeah. For the right reason, get out of the house.
Yeah. Dude, I love that. I think that's a really great place to call it a day. I know that you've gone a little bit over the time we had allocated, and I really, really appreciate your time and kind of sharing your perspective. Like, as I mentioned, you're the founder of Substantial, and as you also mentioned, you have 2 other companies that you started. So you've been at this a couple of times, and clearly you spend a lot of time from a design standpoint, applying the design systems thinking into sales, and what can we do to make things, more human on the sales side of things. And in particular, I like the advice around making it easy to do the right thing and setting yourself up for success, because these are just kind of basic principles. I think all of us get into the day-to-day cloud of dust that happens. You wake up on Monday and all of a sudden it's Friday afternoon and we didn't really do all the things we wanted to do or needed to do. And I think just taking a step back and just kind of thinking about it, understand like getting a customer is the most important outcome.
Yeah.
For the business.
Yeah.
So
absolutely. It's easy to wake up and be reactive to the world, but it's you get a lot more out when you can be proactive and think about how you want to design your life and your how you're spending your time. Yeah. And entrepreneurship overall is just like one of the most fascinating things you can do in the world. It's amazing what we can do by, just assembling some ideas and a few people. You can, create new products and services. You can get people to do new things, change their behavior. I mean, it's really, it's the world changing thing right now, in the modern world. So I want as many people to get out there and learn how to start businesses. And a big part of that's selling. So it's great that you're doing this. I love that you're helping people with this super crucial part of the entrepreneurial process.
Thanks. I appreciate that a lot. Well, listen, how can people get a hold of you if they want to follow up, learn more about you, your company, maybe come to one of your mastermind dinners that you're going to be putting together? Where's the best place for them to get in touch?
Yeah, I am not on social media very much, although I am at Paul Rush on Instagram. That would be one way. I will be putting my new site up at paulrush.com. That will be happening in the next 2 to 6 weeks, depending on when you hear this. Do you have people give out email addresses? Is that a common thing, or is that not?
If you want to, yeah. Hey, you can give away your home address if you want people to stop by. It's your option.
Yeah,
I'm not liable
email
for anything
address
that happens. Just disclaimer.
Sure. My email address is paul@substantial.com if anyone wants to reach out to talk about anything more.
Yeah, this is great. Well, listen, Paul, I'm really, really glad that our mutual friend Jonathan put us together. I know it took a little bit of engineering to find a time because you are busy and you've got lots of stuff going on. And I really appreciate your insights and the approach that you're taking and shared here, because I think it's really valuable to take a step away from hammering away at all the mechanical things and all the tactical things and just kind of think, more deeply about what is it we're really trying to do here when we're running our company and starting our company and getting customers and thinking about the systems. I think is really useful for people to take a step out of that every day.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's a pleasure to talk about these things. I love thinking and talking about these topics. So,
cool, man. Well, look, keep me posted on your events, because I do get up to Seattle from time to time. I'd love to be able to check those out and share with the other people what I learned. So, all right, man.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. We'll talk to you soon.